Okay.
Jack of all graves.
Okay.
Crossfire.
Mark Lewis.
Caught in the
You'll get caught
fire.
up in the. Oh, lyrical
The
genius.
Marcus.
They really
Caught up
phoned
in
that
the
in.
Mark
Okay.
Lewis. All right.
Clap.
Yes, please.
1, 2, 3. Oh, it's me. Okay.
Yep. This time.
Once upon a time, Mark, there was
Mm.
a town called Oscarville, Georgia. But there isn't anymore. Or at
Okay.
least not exactly. Oscarville, along with several other Georgia communities, is at the bottom of Lake Lanier.
Oh, okay. Is it like Atlantis?
It's like Atlantis, but like sad Atlantis.
Oh no.
So in 1950, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began work creating an artificial dam called Buford Dam, which would
Okay.
prevent flooding in the area, and a lake that would supply water and hydroelectric power to Atlanta, which is obviously the huge city in Georgia. So it was a huge multi-billion-dollar undertaking that not only required a massive amount of just basic infrastructure work and all the building that goes into it and everything, but
Mm.
also required buying out or otherwise relocating the communities that had existed in the area already.
Okay. Okay.
Many of which had been there for like literally generations, largely as farming communities. So this area is just farmland as far as the eye can see.
Where are we in terms of history here? In terms of time, where are we?
So this is 1950.
Right. Okay. Thank
When
you.
this happens.
Mhm.
But the repercussions of the process have led Lake Lanier to a reputation of being cursed.
Okay.
Hundreds have died there since its completion in 1957, and naturally, it's rumored to be haunted as fuck. Particularly by one specter who has been known to appear quite frequently to the 7 million or so visitors that come to the lake every year.
Cool.
We'll come back to her. So, as is pretty much the case when we look at American history and how we built this country, it's pretty ugly if you examine it too closely. This is clearly becoming a theme.
Yep, there it is.
Every time I talk about anything in our opens, I'm like, hey, Mark, do you want to hear about how terrible this country actually is if you look at it for a second? So I'm going to do that again today. So Lake Lanier is absolutely no exception to the rule. And you can probably get that hint simply by looking at its name, as its moniker honors the legacy of one Sidney Lanier, a Confederate Army poet. So for those who are not up on US history, those are the baddies in the American Civil War. The Confederates are the guys who are fighting to preserve the institution of slavery in the southern states and its expansion westward. And that will not be the last racist part of this lake's legacy that we talk about here. Surprise, surprise.
So I am not up on my American history. You'll be shocked to learn.
What?
So
crazy.
I know. I was playing hooky that day. So who were the Confederates fighting then? What were the other side called?
The Union.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Union are the people trying to keep the United States together, make one country, all that stuff. And the Confederates are like, fuck you, we're getting out of here. We're going to secede from the United States so that we can preserve slavery, because the North, the Union, had said, we are not going to have slavery up here, and we will not have it continue expanding westward as we move into the rest of what would become what is now the United States.
Whereas the Confederates are like, yes, you fucking will, boys.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, you will. You will not tell me that I
Yeah.
cannot do that. States' rights. So yeah, that's the Confederates, and that's who Lake Lanier is named after.
I see.
Great. It's really cool. So
you say this guy was a Confederate
poet. Yeah. He wrote a famous poem, I believe it was called The Song of the Chattahoochee. And yeah, apparently there had been a lot of like arguing over who they were going to name this thing after, and that was the compromise. Let's say Confederate poet. They're like, I mean, there's clearly nothing that's going to be controversial about that name in the future. So there you go. And mind you, by the way, like as I said, this is built in 1950, right? So this is like 90 years after the Civil War that they named this after this Confederate poet. So yeah, it's kind of like an intentional choice that they made there about who they were going to honor in their Southern history. Ugh, not great. Yeah.
Who would have made that decision? That would have been like town planners. That would have been
Like
officials.
state people. Yeah, state government that was working on making this. Yeah, because it's a state project. It was actually, a United States project. It was a federal project that was being made. So according to Wikipedia, the lake encompasses 38,000 acres, which is 59 square miles of water, which is 150 square kilometers. And 692 miles of shoreline, which is 1,114 kilometers, for your reference. So it's fucking huge. People obviously lived in all of that space. And agriculture was actually booming in that area. It was kind of famous for the fact that somehow the people who were farming there had done something that resisted a huge boll weevil overtaking thing that like had ruined farms elsewhere, but the people who lived in this area had somehow managed to overcome that and still have thriving agriculture there. So lots of farmland in this area. And they had to be convinced to sell their land to the government for this project, which of course to them the land is like priceless.
Convinced.
Right, yeah. So they've lived here forever, the families have lived here forever, and now, the government's like, hey, we need this. This is a big municipal project that we have to work on. But they assured them, of course, that they were going to give them a very fair price for it, that it was going to go for, whatever they were actually worth in order to do this. And then they did, and everyone lived happily ever after.
Fantastic. Welcome to Jack of All Graves.
Jack of All Graves, episode 38. No, that's not what happened. The people sold, but they, like I said, they lived there for generations. So it's not like they were up on what like the real estate market was like in Georgia. And it turned out, of course, that they undersold them on this. And they quickly had seller's remorse when they went to move into other areas and were like, we can't afford life anymore. And also we don't have our farms. So that was super great. The 700 or so families who did sell were the lucky ones, though. Those that didn't want to sell were simply forcibly removed. And the government went on to break down the structures that would be a hindrance to the creation of the lake, like bridges, trees, and anything wooden that could float. Right. They also attempted to move the 20-ish cemeteries that existed in the area, but there's no way of knowing for sure whether they were able to get them all, because it was common practice at the time for families to keep small burial plots on their land rather than in formal cemeteries. So everything that they didn't deem necessary to destroy, they apparently just left when they flooded the area, leading many to believe to this day that there are entire towns sitting at the bottom of Lake Lanier. And at least one of those towns has really bad vibes. So one of those towns is Oscarville, the town I mentioned earlier. Oscarville was home to a fairly thriving Black community in the early 20th century. Until in 1912, there were two high-profile incidents that changed everything. First, a white woman named Ellen Grice accused two Black men of breaking into her home and raping her. Then, a 19-year-old white woman named May Crow was sexually assaulted and brutally beaten to death. In the first incident, a man named Ernest Knox confessed, and he and his half-brother were sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out 21 days later. A Black preacher who had demanded their release and suggested that the sexual liaison might have been consensual was beaten severely by a white mob, and they had to hold him in the jail for his own protection.
Son of a bitch.
Yeah. In the murder case, a Black man named Rob Edwards was arrested, but he would never see trial. As was Southern custom, a white mob came to the jail, abducted him, and beat and shot him to death before hanging him from a tree near City Hall. Several more Black youths were tried and sentenced to death by hanging for the crime as well, and I'm sure you can imagine none of them saw a super fair trial by a jury of their peers. as was common again at the time.
Mm.
Now, we owe a debt to late 19th and early 20th century Black investigative journalist Ida B. Wells, whose work showed that lynchings rarely had to do with actual crimes. Often they were actually economic retaliation. A real quick way to get rid of a Black guy with a competitive business was to say he sexually assaulted a white woman.
Yeah,
A
sure.
mob would take care of him real fast. And she also found that often so-called rapes perpetrated by Black men were consensual relationships, but in a country with lots of anti-miscegenation laws on the books and in an area particularly hostile to the idea of a white woman consenting to be with a Black man, if a
Mm.
mixed race pair were caught hooking up, he wasn't going to get a chance to explain himself. He was just going to get strung up for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's likely that lots of Black men were punished for these crimes who had little to nothing to do with them, but we'll never know because their trials were a sham. And the terribleness didn't end there. The whites took it upon themselves to form vigilante gangs they called Night Riders, because that's super cool. And they made it their job to terrorize the Black residents of Forsyth County. And within months, 98% of the Black population had fled the area for neighboring counties in fear for their lives. And those that stayed, well, their legacy is at the bottom of Lake Lanier. Some 250 families were displaced by the construction of the reservoir, and their homes and communities were just like completely lost to the water. And that doesn't even account for all the like indigenous artifacts and graves and things like that are likely down there somewhere as well, because that's who lived there before all of these people came in.
It's entire communities, entire family lines,
just completely wiped out with no effort made to try to preserve any of this. Just like, sink it. It's fine. But the horrors also don't end there. When they built Lake Lanier, they never intended for it to be a recreational area. It's just a reservoir. It's supplying water to people. It's providing power to people. Like that was the whole point. But eventually they allowed recreational activity here. And once it became used more and more for that purpose, it began to amass an impressive body count. In the years since it was completed, 675 people are estimated to have died there, including one just last week, a 19-year-old boy who dove off a pontoon boat and never resurfaced. And this happened the same day a boat fucking exploded on the lake, wounding several people. Like, just a bizarre amount of weird shit like that happens on that lake all the time. I mean, the lake itself is murky and unpredictable. It's said that you might step from what is knee-high water and suddenly find yourself over a 30-foot drop. There's a ton of like wreckage under the water, from remnants of the place that they flooded out to create it, to sunken boats from years of accidents, all kinds of stuff down there. And because of drought, go ahead.
Are there ever attempts made for kind of salvage or for?
Not necessarily salvage, but there are divers that go down there, and you can actually look on YouTube and find footage of what's
underwater expeditions just for historical kind of interest.
And I think it's hard to preserve anything, and it's so deep at some points, and like it's really hard to go down there and find anything that you could sort of resurface and that you could see. Okay. Like I said, it's extremely murky. If you look up these videos on YouTube, like the visibility is ridiculous. It's just green, and like you can't see very far at all, but you can see a lot of just random junk down there, all kinds of random stuff. And because of drought in recent years, there's been like drought over the past decade, the water level is constantly lowering. So it's revealing more and more hazards underneath that will then like run boats aground and entangle swimmers and all kinds of stuff.
If there's going to be a haunted lake anyway, it's there.
It's absolutely this one. Like it's just bad vibes all the way through.
100%. Yeah.
Plus, on top of all this, there are reportedly catfish the size of Volkswagens down there.
Oh,
can you imagine? This came up when I was in West Virginia last week too, because they said the same thing about the rivers that run by there. Two rivers sort of intersect right there, and they were saying that like when divers were retrieving bodies after the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967, they started refusing to go back down into the water because of the giant catfish. They're like, these are terrifying. Like, imagine you're going down there trying to like grab bodies and whatnot, and then a car-sized catfish just like brushes up against you. Big no thanks. I'll pass on that. Yeah.
So talk to me about the ghost.
Yeah, well, I'm getting there. But before we get there, divers have also reported finding actual body parts underwater there. A diver named Buck Buchanan said in 2017, quote, "You reach out into the dark and you feel an arm or a leg and it doesn't move." Who knows? Who knows who that?
Yeah.
So on top of the ghosts of so many dead and displaced, there is most notably one haunting reported time and time again.
Just briefly, if I was going to make up an American sounding name, it would probably be Buck Buchanan.
I know, right?
That's probably Buck Buchanan. Yeah. That's his name.
So
that's
true.
The character's name.
Yeah, you can't write this. You can't make it up. That is legitimately this guy's name. Yeah. But in April of 1958, a car carrying two women careened into the lake. The women were Delia Parker Young and Susie Roberts. Okay. Delia had borrowed a blue dress for the night out, and according to the Gainesville Times, quote, "They were traced from the Three Gables to a gas station nearby where they left without paying. There were skid marks along the road near the bridge, and it looked as though the car had crossed the center line and went off the side of the road." So probably some shenanigans here, maybe some drunk driving, things like that. Like two girls just like going to a gas station, filling up, ditching, driving off the road.
Pounding some claws.
Some White Claw, breaking the law. And they go careening off of this bridge, but they disappeared. Like they could see the tracks or whatever, but they didn't find a car or anything like that, or bodies, until 18 months later, when a body washed up missing two toes on her left foot and with no hands. Now, supposedly people had been reporting seeing a woman walking along the bridge who would have like no hands or no arms and wearing blue, looking like she was trying to find her lost hands.
Yes.
And in November of 1990, construction on the bridge led to the discovery of a blue 1950s Ford sedan with a body inside, with remnants of a sweater and a slip nearby. And she was eventually ID'd as Susie Roberts, the other person in this car. But for years, and even to this day, people report that woman walking along the Dawsonville Highway Bridge in her blue dress, looking for her hands. And what do you think? I just want you to take a stab at it. What do you think they call the ghost of old Delia?
Fucking spooky blue Mrs. No Hands.
You overthought it. It's exactly what you'd expect it to be. They call her the Lady of the Lake.
Oh, come on, hacks. That is some hack shit. Spooky blue Mrs. No Hands. That's what I demand she be renamed.
Spooky blue Mrs. No Hands. I love that so much. And that is the terrible story of Lake Lanier.
I love it. Obviously, I hate it. I hate all of it, but it's beautifully brought to life. And I learned some shit about the fucking American Civil War. Let me just go off on a little tangent here, because I have a question that I've been meaning to ask you for weeks, but I've always forgotten until this moment.
Ooh, okay.
So the conversation in the UK currently, there's long been a conversation around Scottish independence from the UK, right?
Yes.
And the conversation around Welsh independence is gaining volume and seems to be gaining traction. Scotland has, rightly so in my opinion, a big axe to grind with the way that they were dragged out of the European Union by the South.
Right.
Could a state in the US decide they wanted out of the United States and to set up as an independent nation?
No, absolutely
not.
That's what that's literally what the Civil War was about. It's exactly that. So, it's secession. It's leaving the United States to form your own thing. But there are constantly talks of this. For example, there's an entire region in the Pacific Northwest that is known as Cascadia. And they often talk about seceding from the United States to create their own little weird utopia or whatever that would not be subject to our laws and rules and things like that. But yeah, if anyone actually attempted to secede, that's a thing. We'll go to war over it.
Really?
And
So
there's no way that a state is going to be able to beat an entire US military in a war.
Because this seems fucked. So if Hawaii, for example, right, we're like, do you know what? No,
Boy, that's
we
quite an
want.
example.
Is it? I don't know. I'm really put.
But because Hawaii is like the last state, second to last state, right? And the whole thing is that they should be sovereign because they absolutely had it stolen from them. They had their own monarchy, and basically it was they did.
So if they decided we don't want to be part of the United States anymore, we want out, that would result in conflict, in armed conflict.
Exactly. Yeah. There's really, I mean, we don't even let like we don't let places that technically, like Puerto Rico, for example, is our territory, and they have voted to become a state so that they can actually like be a part of our political system and not just be subject to us. And we don't even let them in, right? Washington, D.C. doesn't have representation in our Congress, right? Like that we are terrible with this stuff. We don't want anybody leaving, whatever, and we will, exert whatever force is necessary. So as much as many places talk about, trying to secede from here, how is any small part of the United States going to go up against the US military?
Because I mean, half of that answer was what I was expecting, and the other half is wildly not. I mean, I was expecting it to be, something Constitution, something Bill of Rights, or whatever the fuck that is. But the other half, and if they decided they wanted to and decided to unilaterally secede and become sovereign, we would simply invade them.
Yeah.
That I did not
didn't see that part coming, huh? Yeah, no. That's legitimately, I mean, what happened in the Civil War. And then after that, they suffered the repercussions of losing a war, just like any foreign government would, right? Like, so they had to like pay back the United States for war debt and, all this stuff like that, hilarious. Even though they were technically part of the United States again. That was the like whole point, which has bred a lot of resentment out of the South as well. But, it's treated as it's a hostile government, hostile, illegitimate government, and thus they will be crushed as a result. So yeah, no, it's impossible.
So further to that, then, is the USA currently actively looking for more states? Is it looking to recruit more states? No, it's done.
No, because also the thing about the United States you have to realize is that we don't like to think of ourselves as imperialists. We and it makes it very entertaining when you look back historically at things like, for example, the Spanish-American War. After the Spanish-American War, we got various territories. Cuba was a protectorate of ours. We got the Philippines. We got Guam. A few places after this. And the way that the president like justified this, because we didn't like to think about ourselves as imperialists, was like, it's actually like our duty and we like owe it to the people of the Philippines. Like it's our Christian duty to take them on. Like, what are we supposed to do? Let them run themselves? They couldn't possibly give them to another. Like, are we going to let France or Germany have them? We can't do that, and
they're really actually already ours. They just don't know it yet.
It was like really like, we must search ourselves and realize like it's the best thing for the Philippines to like belong to us. So we will begrudgingly take on this territory, even though we don't want it. So like the idea of actively now like trying to go and get more territories, more states, things like that, would be a lot of cognitive dissonance in the way that we think about ourselves as a country, because we see ourselves as not doing that. We just kind of ignore that, like, we actually do have several territories. We just don't talk about it. People think Puerto Rico is another country instead of realizing, no, that's us. That's ours.
And yet, as you said, you don't even let those guys in.
Right, exactly. They have no power here. They just belong to us. It's a good
doing
economic
America to
investment. Them. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. We are doing America to Puerto Rico.